but we see certain cultural groups, we see certain kind of socioeconomic groups that are particularly inactive. And I think we absolutely need to target those, because otherwise the inequities just get bigger and bigger. Unfortunately, particularly in maybe some more low-income areas within the UK, that our children are becoming more overweight and obese. I've been looking at more of a whole school approach to physical activity. So these are looking at the kind of times in the school day where you might be able to intervene where maybe historically it hasn't been. So some of the work that we're doing is, can you actually integrate physical activity within curricula, within lessons, so that the children are being active, they're not sitting down, but it's also they're kind of learning in a better way as well. So maybe engaging the ones that are less engaged potentially around mathematics or English in particular.
Hello and welcome to the Experts in Health podcast, brought to you by Loughborough University. This podcast aims to highlight the latest research and trends in health as we welcome a variety of guests from a host of different disciplines. I'm Dr. Chris MacLeod, an academic in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences with an expertise in behavioural nutrition and public health. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Lauren Sherar, who is a Professor of Physical Activity and Public Health at Loughborough University. Lauren, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation.
Well, we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic, physical activities in schools and the impact on that on children's health. So I just want to start with, can you remember still your physical activity at school days? Was that a good thing for you? Was that a positive thing, or was that a pretty bad experience on your side?
No, I think probably bucking the trends a little bit. I think I have a twin sister, so I think we had quite similar experiences through school. Just very positive. I think what stuck with me is there were a couple of inspirational teachers, and they tended to be in the PE departments, particularly at secondary school, but even at primary school we did some good netball and cricket. It was very inclusive, and lots of my friends came from the kind of other, I guess, sporty kids. So I remember it being quite a small group that were doing sports even back then, but yeah, I loved it, and I had lots of opportunities outside of school because of my involvement in school. So I think it certainly shaped who I am today, is my experience with school sport.
It's amazing how the opportunities available to you and the way that the teacher are and how you interact with them has such a role. But how did you get from that experience to where you are today as a Professor of Physical Activity and Public Health? Can you tell us a little bit about you? Yeah,
sure. Yeah, it wasn't as planned as maybe it might look like on paper, or at least on my CV. Grew up, born in London, grew up outside in Buckinghamshire. We moved to a rural place, so we moved to Devon. I went to Exeter College. From there, I got interested. I did A-level PE, I did human biology and communication studies, and I really liked the kind of PE side of it, the sports side of it. Like lots of people, thought I was going to be a physio or a PE teacher. But after a while, I actually thought, well, maybe I wanted to keep my options open. It was quite young to consider what I was going to do. So I did sports science with human biology, so combining both of those interests, not too far from Loughborough University at Nottingham Trent University. So did an undergraduate degree there, really enjoyed it, but particularly enjoyed my final year project, which got me into the idea of doing research. So after a year out, I actually went to Canada to do my master's in the Prairie province of Saskatchewan. So I did a 2-year master's and then stayed on and did my PhD. A little bit of time back in the UK and then back in Canada. And in 2012, I ended up back at Loughborough University. So again, quite close to where I started it all. And from there, I came in as a lecturer and fairly quickly, I guess, progressed up to a professor.
And how would you just briefly describe your area of expertise? Where is your research fit? I've got here, physical activity and public health. Is there anything more specific that you are an expert in?
Yeah, I think I'm quite multidisciplinary. I would say interdisciplinary. I like working with lots of different disciplines, such as psychology, work quite a lot with physiologists, with economics. So I work with lots of different people. I would say my focus is around children and young people. It's where I started my career even as a master's student. So very much interested in the growth and development of children and how that impacts their health, their physical activity and sedentary behaviours. Early on, I had a lot of interest and probably now a bit more expertise in using devices to measure physical activity of children. So we're all quite familiar with pedometers, that measure the steps that a child might do. Lots of other different devices up into even wearable technology such as Fitbits that might measure how much a child or even an adult might do in terms of physical activity. But I have done quite a lot of work in clinical populations. So in general, I'm interested in getting the population more active with a particular focus on children and young people. And I think that's where my interests lie. So much more on the applied side of it and less about the kind of experimental laboratory work that we might see in other places at Loughborough University.
So why then, if we just take it down into children's physical activity, why is this so important? Why should we care about this? Why should the people listening, tuning in today think, I need to really listen to what Lauren's saying?
Yeah, I think probably we see it in social media, we see it on the news a lot. There are a lot of probably now quite obvious benefits of children specifically being physically active, and these go from kind of physical benefits if we think about having healthy bones, if we think about having a healthy weight or our cardiometabolic kind of health, but it also spans to kind of mental health benefits and the social health benefits of, for example, participating in sports, that kind of team dynamics, the confidence that can come from children participating in sports, but even so much about sports or physical activities that are outside, the exposure to vitamin D, to sunlight, all of that is so important, being one with nature, for example. So they're so multifaceted, I think, the benefits of children being physically active, that often they say, and you've probably heard this before, Chris, that if there was a pill that we could take that would give us all of those benefits, we'd be giving it to every one of our children, no problem, like we would a multivitamin. But in reality, it is harder to do it in practice than just taking a pill. But yeah, the benefits are so multifaceted.
So then, we take ourselves to the present day. How active are our children? We've got this potential behavioural pill that's out there that's got some great benefits. Is it working at the moment?
Yeah, it's such a challenging question to answer, and I think it actually comes back to what we call surveillance. So there are lots of different ways of measuring how active our children are. So we can ask them questions, in a form of a questionnaire. We could put a device on them, such as a pedometer, and objectively measure how physically active they are. Unfortunately, in the UK, we don't have great measures of children's physical activity. So we have lots of different questionnaires, and some of them have biases because we have self-report biases. People can't necessarily recall particularly what a 4-year-old child has done in the day and try and capture that on a question. But we also don't have consistent use of devices. But it also depends on actually what we're talking about being physically active. So we've actually seen, particularly in middle and higher socioeconomic groups, the participation in organised sports has probably gone up. And I say probably because we haven't got great data, but it probably has gone up over the last, say, 20 years. But the general feeling is that more lifestyle embedded physical activity has probably been eroded. And so, for example, phones, we probably see it ourselves, they are a good, attractive way to probably spend time inside, sitting down, maybe for children in their bedrooms. That time, they're actually not spending time being physically active. We're definitely driving children to and from sporting events, for example. That's activity where before they might have been actively commuting, they might have been playing out with their friends more likely. So the general feeling is that physical activity has decreased on a population level, but the type of physical activity probably depends. And we certainly have better data, for example, around weight and body mass index, and that shows that unfortunately, particularly in maybe some more low-income areas within the UK, that our children are becoming more overweight and obese. And so obviously that's not just physical activity, that's also nutrition, but that also points to the fact that probably our children are becoming less active at the moment.
So is physical activity something that's quite innate to children, to humans? Do we go towards physical activity like we might be drawn to the dopamine kick that comes from a phone, or do we have to actually fight against our wish to be sedentary to be active. What can you tell us on that?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. I think what we do know is young children are innately active, and they're quite sporadic in their activity. So if you had a 2-year-old now and they were going to move towards the door, they'd probably step up and they'd probably run to the door. If you had a 14 or 15-year-old, they've already been socialized in, and maybe it's to do with the biological processes, to actually walk. So we know that young children are kind of innately active, and that probably sporadic activity does decrease. So we tend to have, and we see this in all mammals, being, an infant, and whether that takes, 2 weeks or 2 months to being an adolescent, to being an adult, they will become less active. So we know this is kind of biological. But we also know there are other really strong drivers for sedentary behaviour. So you might have seen it if you're in a shop and you see a 2 or 3-year-old, and they might be sitting in a pushchair and they might be crying. As soon as the parent gives them a phone, they are still, and they're still for a long period of time. So the addictiveness of, for example, phones, it's not the only thing, but other screens, could potentially be argued to be more potent than the drive to be active. But generally, if you've got a park and you open the door and you say, go play, most children will go and play. But that does decrease as children get older.
I can see that for sure. And it's amazing how social norms play such a role in what is... I'm talking to another guest on the podcast, Lavina Mehta, and we were talking about how it's not normal at the moment to have a meeting where you might just do a couple of squats every now and again. Like it's not that normal, but there's no reason why, if you can do that meeting safely and you can communicate as you want to, that you couldn't just do that. But it's the same as you were saying, as that socialization occurs and there's schools, there's sitting down a lot, there's a lot of norms come in there which say don't move around. So schools then, if we move on to that, is school a helpful setting because of such sedentary behaviour, or because you focus on schools with your work, don't you?
So I would say myself and quite a lot of my peers, other researchers in the field, we do focus on school settings. There's lots of good reasons for that. I think part of it is that you capture about, I'm not sure what the statistic is, but maybe 95% of the population actually go to schools. So if you're thinking about trying to do something cost effectively and reach lots of people, schools are a great setting. It's why often we target workplaces if we're looking at adults. So if we're wanting to be equitable and we're wanting to reach the majority, schools are really good. But also children spend an awful lot of time at schools. So it's a way that we can kind of influence quite a lot of their week, their day, but also parents are quite engaged with schools. So there is that potential to then also influence parents, where we can also then influence the home environment as well. So it is a really attractive way to be able to say, because if we're targeting parents, you've got to target 1 or 2 people or 3 people individually, and that is a very hard thing to do in terms of kind of spreading and sustaining a program, for example. Much easier if we're targeting schools.
So what sort of interventions are you looking at, or that have been successful in schools, or maybe things that haven't been? Because at the moment, as a layperson, I might be thinking, well, there's PE, and then if my school does sport, like a session of netball or cricket or rounders, whatever, then that's what I'm thinking about. Is that the sort of thing that you're looking at? Are there other options?
So for me personally, there are quite a lot of researchers that are actually looking about how you might be able, it's quite a controversial topic probably, but how you might be able to reimagine physical education, maybe make it more inclusive, maybe make it more enjoyable, more around physical activity and less around its kind of traditional mandate. For me, I've been looking at more of a whole school approach to physical activity. So these are looking at the kind of times in the school day where you might be able to intervene where maybe historically it hasn't been. So for example, one of them is active lessons. So we know a lot of lessons are seated traditionally within schools, primary and secondary, although obviously in kind of reception age, it's quite common because it's quite hard to get children to sit still for long periods of time. They probably do more active lessons, but certainly as they get older and there's more pressure towards exams and so forth, a lot of learning is seated. So some of the work that we're doing is, can you actually integrate physical activity within curricula, within lessons, so that the children are being active, they're not sitting down, but it's also they're kind of learning in a better way as well. So maybe engaging the ones that are less engaged potentially around mathematics or English in particular. Other opportunities are like these kind of daily running programs, like the Daily Mile, which you might have heard of. Yeah,
you've done work around that.
Yeah,
haven't you? Yeah.
So a little bit on Daily Mile, but also similar programs that have similar principles to the Daily Mile. But the ideas of this is, can you just take children out for, say, 15 minutes to half an hour, maybe do something where they're still in their school uniform, so they're not kind of having to have that kind of extra time of getting changed into PE kit, and they might go and walk and or run around a field or around a playground for the Daily Mile. It would be around about a mile, and then they come back in and they start doing their kind of lessons as always. So it's a way of kind of very easily integrating physical activity within the school day. And then there are energizer breaks that can be done before school, like breakfast energizer breaks, and also after school, and active commuting as well. Can children be more active when they're coming to school rather than being driven in a car? And obviously that has environmental and sustainability leverages as well. So yeah, lots of kind of being creative around the whole school approach.
And how have you done any research looking at how children maybe compensate for these periods of time that you carve out of a school day to increase exercise? Have they been shown to decrease it in other times in the day because they have been active elsewhere, so there's no net gain? Or is there a net gain?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris, that kind of idea of compensation, because, you know, if we were spending a lot of time kind of intervening on one part of the day and actually overall net benefit is no better, then it could be argued that that's not worth doing. There is some literature out there, not necessarily showing it in the programs I've worked on, but in other programs, so there is a little bit of a compensation effect. So a good example is if a parent might know that their child has been doing the Daily Mile every day for that week, they kind of know, well, my child's done quite a lot of physical activity. Is there the kind of importance for me now to go out and maybe do a run with the child, or for them to go outside? Maybe they say, actually, you can sit in and be on your phone for a bit longer or on the Xbox for a bit longer because you've been active at schools. And there is a little bit of literature that shows that that might be the case.
Interesting. So what other, I can see that as a barrier. Before I ask you, I just thought of another one. Staff in schools, you know, they work incredibly hard, you know, children's teachers, and they're already thinking about, how do I teach all of this content? I might have inspections to prepare for, and I just need the children really to be in the room. They just need to stay there so I can deliver this content. How can I fit in more stuff? What would you say in response to that critique?
Yeah, I'm just very sensitive to that, and if I'm not a teacher myself, but I could absolutely imagine they've got an awful lot of pressure on them to basically do what they're paid to do, which is to educate children well. They have a lot of other things like oral health, healthy nutrition, physical activity. They've got a lot of other kind of extra, which is really important for children, but some could argue that's someone else's responsibility, not necessarily schools. So I think what we really need to do is make sure that we're doing things that embed and enrich the school learning environment, so it can't detract away from it. But we also need resources. We need to be able to support teachers if they are going to be part of the solution of healthy children, whether it be physical activity or nutrition or oral health. Then we can't just keep adding on and adding on. I think back often to kind of Victorian times, obviously not that I was around then, but Victorian classrooms, they were very much seated. Normal, all of the children would have been normal weight. They would have had other health issues, but it wouldn't been around lack of physical activity. So, it's not that our schools now are more sedentary and less active. If anything, they're more active. They provide much more active opportunities than they did, 50, 60, 90, 100 years ago. But the reality is lots of other lifestyle physical activity is being eroded outside of the school. And because of that, we're putting more pressure within the school to say, because of the reasons I talked about before, that it is a good place to intervene to reach a wide part of the population. But I would argue, and there's quite a lot of literature that's coming out now about active lessons, that actually it can improve, especially for certain subsets of children, it can actually improve their engagement, their enjoyment, and even some of the kind of academic achievement matrix are coming out showing that it's actually quite useful for learning, and that's what teachers are paid to do. So we really need to look to find things that are not distracting away and adding increased pressure and stress on teachers, I think, because they already do such a great job and already have a lot of pressure on them.
So that's a really positive thing, that we could see that certain children can actually really benefit from this. But from my view, I don't see there a big push in the media advertising that we're going to be doing these active lessons now. Am I not seeing what is actually happening, and that there is quite a lot still going on? Or have we got quite a lot of progress to do in the UK, for example, to embed this properly in our school system?
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of work to do. And to be honest, we've got a lot of kind of research, kind of innovation work to do to understand how best to do it. There are a number of kind of companies that I work with that are actually doing a really fantastic job about implementing and supporting active lessons in schools. And when I see what they're doing, I'm really encouraged. But it isn't the same. It hasn't had the same limelight as, for example, the Daily Mile did. And part of that is because it's hard. It's we know as university lecturers that you get taught how to teach. You develop your own pedagogy style. Teachers will be the same. And actually asking a teacher to go from what they've had maybe 10, 20 years of experience doing and teaching in a certain way to then suddenly kind of tweak that and change that so that they're actually having active lessons. That requires retraining, that requires some really conscious effort, and sometimes it requires that kind of space to be creative, and sometimes that's not possible for some teachers in some schools. So I think it's getting better, but I think it is a harder thing to do, I think, is to kind of persuade and train and support a wide variety of teachers to do active lessons.
So there's a sort of a piecemeal approach where individual teachers, if they feel they've been enabled and have the skill set currently, they might be able to do it. But where in the systems thinking of things does this need to start? Who's responsible ultimately for making sure that education that's around physical activity is in schools?
Oh, that's a big, good question. I mean,
don't have to answer it.
Yeah, broader in terms, I'm not sure. I think it's hard to say in terms of physical activity, because I think it depends a lot on the type of physical activity. Whether it's kind of active commuting to schools would be quite different probably than, for example, physical education, which we know who's responsible for that. I think kind of more locally, I think I'm going to slightly not answer your question, Chris, but a roundabout route. I think teacher training is a fantastic opportunity. I think when you have teachers that are in that kind of, they've got a very open mind, they're very early in their career and they're open to influence, I think that's a great time to kind of introduce active lessons. I think you always need senior leaders' support. So you will never move anything, and I've learned this, you'll never move anything in schools without having kind of senior leaders' support, for good reason, because they need to be able to, I mean, it's not all about Ofsted, but they need to be able to create a narrative why this form of teaching, which sometimes if someone walks past a classroom when a teacher is doing active lessons and the children are running around, and it can look like chaos, it can look like a badly run classroom. But if they know, and they're part of it and they've been trained and their kind of assumptions have been checked around what a kind of a good classroom is, then that can work really very well. So I think a lot of it comes to, and that's why a whole school approach is so important. We all know, you probably can remember back from your school years, you always have physical activity champions in schools. Often they might be a PE teacher, but not always. But it's not enough just to have one advocate or two advocates. You need kind of everyone to buy into the mission. And always you need the support and resources. And we need to be able to resource schools to be able to do anything that's creative or innovative.
You can see it, the importance all the way up the structure of that support, because it could be that we start this process with the early teachers who have just been trained. But actually, if they don't feel like they can try something different to what's new, then they might feel, no, I can't do that. I can't possibly push the boundary when I haven't got that support. And I can see that going all the way up to the political government
Absolutely.
level. If you haven't got someone who's that champion, or and it can go all the way up to
you need
the
champions at every level. Absolutely.
So how does it work then with these interventions? I can think about blanket interventions that you might put in that a school does, like a Daily Mile or whatever. But what about targeted? And I'm thinking particularly for younger children, that is it correct that girls might be less active than boys? Is that a correct stat? And should you then just be targeting those who are less active now, or should you blanket approach?
Yeah, that's another good question. And I think one of the most kind of pervasive findings that we see it in nearly all studies, and we see it across the globe, it doesn't matter if it's the UK or the US or in Africa somewhere, is that we see if you take a kind of a class in a school, on average, so not at the individual level, but on average, girls are less active than boys. And I think for particularly about 10 or 15 years ago, that really led a lot of resources to be channeled to targeting girls only, with the idea that boys are more active, they're fine, we'll kind of let them be and we'll just target girls. And we know that targeted interventions work well, but we also know that boys are becoming less active as well as girls. And there's actually some research, some of the research that I've done previously, but also other people have done, which actually shows that maybe the reason why we see that boys are more active than girls at a chronological age, so an age in a school, for example, is because they mature approximately 2 years later. So we all know that, boys in general go through their growth spurt in height later than girls. So it actually might be more of a biological process. And actually, if you take that into account, so the kind of biology differences between boys and girls on average, they're about the same physical activity levels. So the way that I see it is that we need targeted approaches, but I think it's a mistake to think that boys don't need their own interventions, because we do see a lot of boys that are not achieving the health benefits from physical activity in the same way that we see girls. But we see certain cultural groups, we see certain kind of socioeconomic groups that are particularly inactive, and I think we absolutely need to target those, because otherwise the inequities just get bigger and bigger. And unfortunately, we sometimes see that. So we see a new leisure centre popping up, and the people that are visiting that leisure centre are the same people that are also benefiting from maybe the more expensive sports clubs that their parents can afford them to do, and various other, maybe have big gardens and access to green spaces and parks. So we absolutely need to target children that don't have those opportunities or are just the least active for whatever reason that might be.
So we probably have parents listening and watching to this. Talking about the more piecemeal approach, where we can, maybe just contact one person and give them some thoughts about how they could improve their family situation. Is there anything that you can offer to the parents that are listening to help their children with this beautiful medicinal pill that you're suggesting?
Well, I have, as you know, Chris, I have 3 children, so they're kind of the older teenage years now, but it's a real challenge. You can read papers and you can conduct research studies, but the realities of kind of embedding physical activity within our own lives, it is a challenge. I think wherever possible for parents to be active with their children is a great thing. I think you got the kind of role modelling side of it, but also you don't want the parents' physical activity to go down because they're trying to facilitate their children's physical activity. And my youngest plays basketball all over the place, and so I'm driving to Manchester, sitting on a bench, driving back from Manchester. That's a lot of sedentary time, and time where maybe I would have been active. So I think wherever there are opportunities for the family to be active together, I think it can only help the family dynamics, but also I think it can help everyone to be active and to kind of see the values of physical activity.
Makes sense. And in terms of the research then, what are you currently exploring? What are the different projects that you've got ongoing that you can tell us about?
Great. Well, I'll talk about two. So one of them is a very exciting project. So it's based in Ghana and Kenya. So it's actually a global project. As you know, Chris, there's been probably quite a lot of work about improving nutrition in kind of sub-Saharan Africa and other kind of low to middle income settings. But there's been a little bit less about physical activity. And I think that's because of the preconceived notion that children in Africa, for example, are all active. And many of them are, but with the increase in urbanisation, they're experiencing the same challenges to having their children be active as we are here. And so we've got a grant that's just started, so it only started in January, where we're looking at developing and evaluating an intervention which will likely be based in schools in both Ghana and Kenya to try and increase adolescents' physical activity. So that's that one. And then we've got another very exciting project here in the UK, which will start in September, which is looking around active maths lessons. So this is collaborating with some fantastic researchers that are based at Loughborough University that are in the Maths Education Centre. And they are real experts around the kind of cognition and the learning of mathematics. They don't know much or care as much about the physical activity side. We know and can measure the physical activity side. So we're working together to really see, and it comes back to some of the points we were talking about before, we absolutely need to make sure that if we are providing programs and support and resources for to increase physical activity during, for example, maths lessons, we really need to make sure that it's also, while improving their health and maybe enjoyment, it's also improving the pedagogy of teaching maths and the kind of cognitive aspect of that. So and that's working with a really good company called Teach Active, which I've been working with for a couple of years now. Wow. So a nice collaboration with a kind of a small business as well.
Lots of great research then, and I can see you can go down all the different subjects, trying how you get physical activity in history and geography and French or whatever it might be. Apart from that then, what else do you think needs to be explored? You know, if you were given £10 million and some years of free research to do it, what would you do?
I think there are a couple of things. I think the first one is more around, it's not very exciting, but it's more around the surveillance, the kind of measurement. We don't in the UK have a really good picture about how active our children are and how active kind of different pockets of our country are. And we know that data drives decisions. It drives decision for government, for policymakers. So we have the National Child Measurement Programme that's been very successful, running for many years, where it goes into schools and takes good measures of height and weight and can then measure body mass index, which is an indicator of being normal weight, overweight or obese. And they do that twice in primary school. Because of that, we've had obesity strategy documents that have come out. We've had resources, we've had policy action based on that. We haven't seen the same as much with physical activity, although there is some really great work with Sport England leading it. But we need some better data. We need to absolutely know how active our children are. And then we can actually answer that question that you asked me at the beginning, is are we seeing a decline in physical activity? It's a really complex behaviour to measure. So I think that would be kind of something that I think is really important. It's not as attractive, I think, or it's not as exciting, but absolutely important. And then I think my second one, which I have to probably acknowledge a colleague of mine, Andy Daly-Smith, who's at Bradford University, but he's doing some really excellent work, and we do collaborate with him around a whole school approach, so creating active schools as the framework. But I really, truly believe, and he's been doing great work spearheading this, that we need to take a whole school approach, and there's no easy fix. There's no silver bullet, I'm afraid. There's no one program, no one intervention that's going to fix it. So yes, I think they have been kind of my two exciting things moving forward.
And where can people go to find out what you're doing at the moment going forward? Is there anywhere that people can get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. So I obviously have an academic profile page, which is at Loughborough University. I'm also a member of the Climb Centre as well, and I can be contacted via social media. So yeah, any of those.
And so just to finish off, you know, you've had an incredibly successful career, and you've done that, being a mother, you're a senior leader, you're a very kind person, incredibly hardworking. How would you sell all of that to someone who was Lauren when they were younger? You know, why is what you've done a good thing for them to look at and to maybe pursue?
So why should someone follow the same path as me? I think, I'm actually not sure. I think it's a really privileged place to be in. I think being an academic is, particularly at such a great university, I think it is a real privilege. We can have impact, we can educate the next greatest minds, which I absolutely love doing, and work with great colleagues. So I think anyone that's wanting to take that route, I think you've just got to, enjoy every day. I think do good work. And I think the most important thing is to not let either society or yourself, narrow what you think that what you think that you can do. I don't know if I ever saw myself as being an academic. I don't love public speaking. While I'm quite a chatty person, one-to-one, it wasn't something that I thought I would ever be able to do. Even teaching, in front of 100 students would have terrified me as an 18 or 19-year-old. But I think you carry on doing what interests you, and then that will take you down a path, and then you will surprise yourself. At least that's what my experience was.
It's a wonderful inspiration piece. Lauren, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a fab chat.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, and thank you very much for tuning in. If you've enjoyed what we've talked about today, then feel free to like or subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. And you can also check out our other podcast, Experts in Sport. And you can find a link to that in the show notes. So that just leaves me to say once again, thank you so much for tuning in. And I look forward to welcoming you back to another health-related discussion in a future episode. Bye-bye for now.